The tragedy of the Counter-Strike major is that it is largely becoming irrelevant to the professional esports scene in Counter-Strike. That being said, this is TeaTime with TeaTime. I'm TeaTime. I'm bringing to you TeaTime today with only myself because we weren't able to get a guest for today's show. But regardless, the point is that the Counter-Strike major is becoming very quickly irrelevant due to a couple of factors, but quite frankly, largely due to how Valve has actually structured the major format and how Valve has chosen to allow the format of Counter-Strike as an esport to be structured out. This video will mostly consist of comparisons being drawn between Counter-Strike's major, the Dota International, and to some extent League of Legends World Championships. Now, a couple of things do need to be kept in mind. I realize these are very different games, and because of that, they've got very different audiences, and that make a few things different and a few things possible for Dota and League of Legends, which aren't really possible for Counter-Strike. That's not the point I'm trying to make. These are comparisons being drawn to show how the relevancy of the Dota International and the League of Legends World Championships is completely different to what Counter-Strike's major is, and to what Counter-Strike's major perhaps should be. Now, let's start with a bit of background about the CSGO major. The CSGO major is supposed to be the absolute premium event for Counter-Strike. This is supposed to be 2 a year. These are supposed to be the most prestigious events imaginable. The team that wins this should, technically speaking, be the absolute best team at the event, should, technically speaking, be the absolute best team of that particular Counter-Strike season, because it is, at the end of the day, an end towards a story, and every single chapter of Counter-Strike traditionally should begin anew with the next major. Every single era of Counter-Strike should, technically speaking, in my opinion, begin with the next major. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I say that the CSGO major has become irrelevant, and chief of which surrounds the current controversy with the roster changes and with rules being very much up in the air about these things, and with the inconsistencies that were coming through in the opinions of teams. Now, let's take a look at which teams are actually going to be playing with stand-ins, which key teams which really matter will be playing with stand-ins more likely than not within the upcoming major. So first of all, there's Astralis. I'm not going to talk about them because Device is ill, and that's an exceptional case. Then there is Team Liquid, who have a registered fifth in the form of Stanislaw, and then there's SK, who very recently went through a roster change, with Phelps leaving the roster of his own volition apparently, and Bolts coming into their new roster. And SK said that this roster change would be happening regardless of whether or not Phelps would be playing with them at the major. Now, if we look at this, we can clearly see that these teams are prioritizing, and these players are prioritizing leaving their rosters earlier on, or making a roster change in a sense that Liquid brings in Steel, and they're playing with him at other events. So evidently, they think that these other events combined are more important than the CSGO major. The reason why I say this creates an aura of irrelevancy around the major is because, quite frankly, that's just simply how it is now. The CSGO major doesn't matter enough to teams for them to actually look at the roster change rules and understand that I messed up. For them to actually look at the roster change rules and say, you know what, we're not going to change our roster until after the major. We want to be able to have a steady 5-man lineup. We want to be able to have this entire thing where we have 6 months of training with these 5 people, and then we're going to go into the CSGO major, and then we're going to rock it with our roster that we have got registered. Yes, there's a period of a few months where you can change around the roster a little bit, but evidently these teams prioritized the ESL Pro League, these teams prioritized the ECS in some cases, and these teams are prioritizing other major tournaments where they are taking their newer members rather than taking their old members, such as Phelps and Stanislaw, for whatever reason. So evidently we can already see that there's a trend of teams not really prioritizing this. Then there's all these other teams like FaZe, etc., who are saying that, okay, this major will have an asterisk attached to it if we win it, because SK will have Phelps, because Team Liquid will have Zeus instead of Steel or Stanislaw. So perhaps we're going to have some question marks surrounding who the best North American team is. Is it going to be Team Liquid, Cloud9, Misfits, even within contention after their run at ESL Pro League? Though you can disagree with me on that. That's not the point of the video. So evidently, we've established that the CSGO major is very quickly becoming irrelevant compared to what it should be. Now, I'm not saying that the CSGO major doesn't matter for more than other traditional tournaments. It's still very, very important. But if you look over towards the context of importance of what should be two biggest events in the year, is it really though? Look at Epicenter. Look at, to some extent, the ESL Pro League, where we've got all these amazing storylines coming together and where we've got all of these amazing teams and huge viewership numbers, huge prize monies. I think Epicenter was something ridiculous, like $500,000. No, wait, that's the Dota Epicenter. The ESL Pro League was $750,000 prize spot. That's very close to the major as well. So you can already see that the major's prize money seems a little bit comparatively not as important. So that's where you say, okay, you know what? It's prestige. The team that wins the major has to be the absolute best. That's not true anymore. There's asterisks attached to so many of the iconic major victories, which make no sense to me personally, but let's go ahead and repeat them anyway. We've got the PGL major where Fine Gambit beat Astralis, and I believe it's just Astralis. Gambit beat Astralis, which was the one big team that they beat to be able to get to the major finals. Then you go ahead and say, oh, but you know, SK and Astralis went against each other because of wonky format. Immortals probably shouldn't be in that major finals. So Gambit get a little bit of a pass over there. It's an easy win for them, so to speak. They weren't truly challenged, and there's always going to be an asterisk surrounding their win. Then if you look back towards the earlier major in 2017, that was the E-League major that happened earlier. That's where you say, oh, but SK had Fox and, well, you know, they didn't have FNX. They didn't have their proper 5-man roster. They were playing with the stand-in. That's bonkers to me, quite frankly. You've got SK playing with Fox of their own volition because they did poorly at one event and were having internal conflicts with, I think it was FNX. Correct me if I'm wrong. But FNX, and that's why they chose to remove him. Again, showing that they prioritize a few things over what could potentially have been a major winning roster, considering that at the time, VP and Astralis were the two teams in contention to actually win. And SK has a great run of form against Astralis now and then. Astralis could have potentially, with a few changes here and there, Astralis could have gone against VP earlier on. SK could have beaten Astralis in the finals. Of course, Astralis versus SK always been a very good matchup for Astralis. But the point is, there have been that potential without Fox, without kind of a dead weight fifth man. And this just trend goes back and more. There's always asterisks surrounding certain victories, perhaps other than 2016 Cologne, which obviously Luminosity or SK now won. So why is this happening? Why are these irrelevancies coming up when you compare it to something like Worlds and the International for Dota, where if you win these events, you are the undisputed best? No one can say Team Liquid was not the best team in Dota 2 when they won the International. No one could say that Samsung Galaxy was not the best team in League of Legends at that time when they beat out SKT's Legacy in the Worlds 2017. That simply isn't true. So I've brought this into about 3.5 reasons on why exactly this is. So firstly, there's no regional storylines in CSGO. And by this, I mean, if you compare CSGO to MOBAs and to some extent StarCraft as well in the past, where you look at how there's specific scenes and every single scene has their own style of play because of how isolated they are. So in Dota, you've got China, which is completely different. Southeast Asia, completely different. Europe and North America do have some things that are in common, but even then, largely North American meta games are completely different. So you've got all of these meta games coming together and clashing at only one major huge event of an absolutely stellar proportions where all the best teams are going to be. This doesn't happen in CSGO. You've got events happening day to day that are $250,000 events, and because these $250K events are so prestigious in unto themselves, you've got these IEMs, you've got DreamHack Masters, you've got ESL ones, now the EPL finals as well. Why exactly would there be a difference in metagames, and why exactly would there be regional storylines when we're consistently seeing the best teams from all of these regions coming together? Then you have to take into account the fact that CSGO as an esport has a lot more nationalistic lineups, and by that I mean you've got a lot more all Danish lineups, you've got a lot more all Swedish lineups, all French lineups, and whenever you look at an international team like FaZe, for example, being formed, these international lineups are very largely experimental and don't always succeed. Look at Optic, look at Penta from before, look at all of these teams that aren't and haven't been the absolute best of the best. So CSGO does have regional storylines, but they're also confined within Europe even, where you've got all of these teams that are specifically Danish and Swedish and everything, that there's not really a European metagame. There are slight changes in metagame from country to country, yes, so you see more execute heavy styles coming out from Denmark, Sweden, well, who knows what Sweden's doing, but basically you can see the point. French teams have their force buying mentality. Then if you compare it towards the North American scene, what we would like to see is what happened in Dota, for example, from the International 4 onwards in 2014, where the North American scene was very weak before that. Then came out Evil Geniuses as a roster with the legendary PPD plus 4, PPD, Zai, Fair, RTZ, and there was one more person who I can't, Universe, of course. So these 5 were players of a completely different caliber. Think SK and Luminosity back then, when they got into North America and when they started dominating despite having the same competition and everything. That's what it was like for Evil Geniuses back then, because North America was an atrocious region. And Evil Geniuses would just stomp through everyone. And then it was always a question mark, but wait, how is EG going to play up against teams from the other side of the world? How is EG going to be playing against the Chinese teams? How is EG going to be playing against the European teams? Similarly, you look over towards League of Legends. Every single time you've got TSM dominating their own NA LCS. You've got all of these teams that look so good. But when they go against the Koreans, that's where their mettle is tested. That's where you've got the epic storylines that, okay, Misfits just went against SK Telecom in, I believe it was the quarterfinals in the Worlds this year. Misfits went against SK Telecom, the best team, the absolute best team of all time in League of Legends. And you see a great best of 5 where Misfits manages to get 2 maps off of them. That is ridiculous. The storylines behind that, the excitement behind that, because there's no other event that can give you that. There's no other event that brings together the entire world in the same way as the League of Legends World Championships do, as the Dota International do, where you've got the 3 emperors of Dota coming together. And by the 3 emperors, I mean the 3 iconic captains from each region. We had Puppy from Europe, you had PPD from North America, and you had Xiaoye from China. All of these 3 captains coming together on one event. The storylines were incredible. You saw a completely different metagame being developed over the course of the international. And this is something that's very famous in every single international. Once you're at TI, any team can win. Once you're at TI, there is no more metagame, because teams save strats for the international, and that's something that teams don't do for the CSGO Major, because there isn't enough incentive to. If you look over towards what you're getting from the CSGO Major, you're not getting enough. You look at all of these other 250k tournaments, they give you so much prestige, they give you so much prize money in comparison to the CSGO Major as well, that it simply isn't worth saving strats in the same way it might be for the international, in the same way it might be for the League of Legends World Championships. So already you see a trend being established where, okay, the problem in CS is we don't have an Asian scene. We don't have isolation. So the regional storylines that could be developed if we had, say, maybe a couple of good Asian teams, like if Tyloo was any good, or if we had another team and it wasn't Renegades who always managed to get through with Tyloo in the minor, then maybe you'd have some regional competition, some regional storylines, some of these teams being able to come forward and say, put a question mark up above their heads, which is like, all right, they're a Chinese team. China has no CSGO scene, but they look really, really good. What happens when they go up against one of the better North American teams? What happens when they go up against one of the better European teams? What happens then? That isn't there in CSGO. You know what's going to happen. They're going to get steamrolled. That's all. Then if you look over towards Europe and North America, which are the big 2 regions, obviously you can say Brazil is a region in its own, but I would like to include it with North America for this discussion. So Europe and North America, there's honestly no isolation. North Americans follow European players. We don't have a proper metagame being developed by North Americans. Sure, you've got SK, who are the innovators of North America, because obviously they're not from North America, but you've got SK, and sure, you've got Optic going in and they're just completely dominating, but you don't have a North American metagame. So there's no big clash of metagames. There's no big fight for supremacy. There's no big, all right, who will be the best? Which region is the best? Which region can come here and show that their metagame is so strong and their metagame can adjust towards what is now being formed within the major, that this is a fight of epic proportions. That's what it feels like in the League of Legends World Championships, in the Dota 2 International. because it really is a fight for supremacy of regions. Because even when you look over towards the weaker regions like Southeast Asia, historically, they've always been able to field 1 or 2 teams that make it to the top 6, make it to the top 8. You look over from TI3, you had Orange Esports, which almost managed to take down Na'Vi, who are the colossal legacy at that time, who had been to every single international finals. You had Tongfu, a Chinese team who did so incredibly well against Na'Vi as well. You have all these teams that keep on coming forward because you aren't seeing them throughout the year. You aren't seeing them play at every single tournament again and again. You aren't seeing them having themselves tested constantly. So imagine what we had at the ESL Pro League finals. Imagine the SK versus FaZe matchup that we had, where you have 2 teams that are number 1 and number 2, and we don't know who the best is. We haven't had them face off in a grand final best of 3. Imagine that in every single game. That's what the Dota International is like. To a lower extent, that's what the League of Legends World Champions is like to a viewer like myself. So you look over towards those, you've got huge teams, colossal giants, and they're all warring against each other to be able to make sure that their region is supreme, that their metagame is the best, that their style of play is unique and the best. Obviously, this is a little bit hard to implement in CSGO because of the restrictions of regions and everything, but you can already see that the storylines are reduced. You don't have a region versus region warfare. You don't have this fight for supremacy going on between each region at the CSGO major. The major isn't a mecca of CSGO where all these teams converge into one point and all of these teams are fighting amongst themselves, because they just doesn't happen in the context of the other international tournaments. It just isn't the same. You don't have all of these teams that all have the capability of being able to win in some way or the other. And the second point that I think is one of the big reasons why, and this has 2 parts to this point, you have a very short event for the CSGO major. Even with the addition to 24 teams now, it's a very short event. It's the main event, the event that everyone looks forward to with the top 16 teams is generally like a week long. There's a day off in between, things on those lines, and that limits things so much. That limits the format, that limits the supplementary content, because what people need to understand is that the CSGO game itself is not the end game. The CSGO game it's basically a resolution. You come down, you have this entire storyline being developed. All right, this is the major. You've got SK versus Astralis going on. Even if it's just the group stages, you've got all of these storylines in your head. It's like, all right, SK won EPL, Astralis, but Astralis is always really good against SK. FaZe against SK probably isn't a good matchup for FaZe, but what happens if Gambit comes in? If Gambit's able to upset FaZe, so Astralis can go up against SK. There's all of these storylines going on in your head. And the climax is the game. But the fact of the matter is these storylines need to be established with supplementary content. You need to have videos. You need to have documentaries. You need to have player documentaries. You need to have all of this supplementary content coming together to shape your experience, to make it feel like a major, to make you understand that this has the gravity that no other event has. In CSGO, the entire season is nothing if you're able to win this event. Yes, it's going to give you a huge amount of prestige if you're very good in the season, but if you bomb out at the major, then mate, you bombed out at the major. That's what it is. That's how it is. OG, a Dota 2 team, never won a TI. It doesn't matter how many Dota majors they've won. They've won so many majors. They've won so many Valve events, but they've never done well at an international. They always bomb out, and that's why they won't be known as one of the greatest of all times. They're a great team, but they're not one of the greatest of all times. So it's a shorter event. So instead of, say, something like a Dota event where you've got the international, you've got a 10 to 12 day event, including the group stages, it's not like that. Actually, no, it's 10 to 14 days. Sorry, it's about 14 days long, if I remember correctly, generally speaking. And that means there's so many formats you can explore. Look at it. The Dota, I believe the TI6 format was you sorted it into 2 teams, 2 groups of 8. You had a best of 2 round robin, so every single team had to play against all other 7 teams in their group twice, 2 games. It's not a best of 1, it's a best of 2, so it still would matter a lot in CSGO. And then you're still not eliminated. You go and fight up in a double elimination bracket. Now imagine this, a format like that in Counter-Strike. How epic would that be? That would eliminate so many big question marks. Like right now, it's like, can FaZe win a major if SK, let's assume for now, SK has balls. Can FaZe win the major? But wait, FaZe has a bad matchup against SK. You know what? It's fine. If they're lucky, then G2 or Astralis will fight up against SK. They'll eliminate SK. Teams that have a much better matchup against SK will be able to eliminate SK, and FaZe can kind of just, cruise through towards the finals and win it. Mate, you're not the best team in the world if you're doing that. FaZe would not be the best ever. Now, if you look over towards a double elimination best of 3 style format after a group stage where you're playing best of 2s against 7 teams, do you know how amazing that would absolutely be? Do you know how much planning would go into that? Because now, remember, group stage teams, they can't reveal everything that they've got in the bag because all of these other analysts will be examining them, because all of these other people will be examining them. Teams have to come prepared with so much more than what they know. And this is how a new metagame is developed within the confines of one event, because of how long it is, because of how much teams can adjust during the event duration, how much they can learn during the event duration. And look at this, just imagine this. FaZe, sure, someone beats out SK. SK drops down to the lower bracket. If SK loses 2 best of 3s within the main stage, then they deserve to lose. Then they deserve to be out. But if SK manages to bring it back from the lower bracket, say if Astralis gets eliminated by someone like FaZe, but they manage to bring it back through the lower bracket and they manage to figure something out about FaZe, face them again at some point later on in the tournament, be it in the finals or be it in the lower bracket after FaZe has been knocked down, how epic would that be? Astralis going up against FaZe, their second chance, their second shot at vengeance within the same event, and FaZe has to be consistent enough to be able to beat them out. FaZe has to realize that Astralis will adjust on the basis of what happened to them before, and that's how you prove that you are the absolute best of the best. When you can weather out a double elimination format, when you can go through to the very end after beating every single team that could be a contest, that could be a challenge, that's when you know that you are the undisputed best at that time. And quite frankly, that simply isn't the case right now in the Counter-Strike Major. There is no such thing as the undisputed best right now, because there's a question about matchups. And if you look over towards this, if you want the most extreme hyperbole example of this, look at Gambit versus FaZe. Gambit is a team that can absolutely eliminate FaZe. Gambit is a team that can absolutely win best of 3s against FaZe. You are not going to have Gambit be the best team in the major. Quite frankly, it's just not going to happen. If Gambit beats out FaZe, even if it's a best of 3 within the quarterfinals, within the playoff, if FaZe gets eliminated by Gambit, I'm sorry, what kind of a goddamn storyline is that? Do you really think for a second that FaZe clan is worse than Gambit as a team just because they lose to them? Gambit has a great veto versus FaZe. Now, if you compare that towards a double elimination, that's where things get tricky. That's where things change, because now, sure, FaZe has a second chance, and now they're probably not going to be playing against Gambit. They're going to be playing against all the other teams. And now, sure, you could get unlucky. You could go against an SK. But other than that, you could also go up against an Astralis. You could go up against a team like Liquid, like Cloud9. These teams are all very likely going to be in that lower bracket at that stage. So that's where things are. You eliminate so much more variance, so much more of the dependence on format, and there's no asterisks at that point. At that point, no one cares if someone has an injury. At that point, you have to fight through so much to be able to actually achieve victory at an event like that, that you are the undisputed best at that time. There is no question about it. There is no asterisk to it. You simply are. Then there's the other thing, which is a slightly smaller point. That's why I said it's half a point. It's that in a shorter format, there's a lot less talent at the event. And you might think this is something that's really small. And obviously this would benefit me a lot if more talent was invited, because I would have a slightly better chance of getting to the major. But if there's less talent at the event, then you've got the 3 duos who are, Bardolph and DDK, Anders and Moses, Sadicus and Henry G. You've got the 3 duos there as commentators. And that's it, really. You've got maybe a couple of analysts here and there. Yanko, Spines, Torin, Richard Lewis on the desk, or, Richard Lewis, Scoots, or Red Eye as host. And that's pretty much it, honestly. That you don't have an excess of talent. You don't have an excess of people sticking around. Now, the reason why I think this isn't a good thing is because if you've got a longer event, then you have to bring more talent. That's where you can actually exploit the talent's capabilities to build storylines a lot more effectively. So you look over towards how the Dota International 2016 did it. It was very interestingly done, actually. So they had 2 desks One was the outdoors desk, which was a little bit more fun, or, you know, it switched out towards the professional side. One was the indoors desk, which was the main desk, which was hosted by Red Eye. The outdoor desk was hosted by Shiver. So you had two hosts, you had two desks going on. One of them generally did things like draft analysis. One of them focused on the very technical aspects of the game, and the other one focused more on the narrative building. You give more time towards desks to be able to discuss things. You give more times to be able to build storylines and show the really cool shit that's going on within a major, within the context of having the greatest players of CSGO combined together. So there's a lot of things you can do with talent like that. And then there's the other thing. Okay, as you're building up in the tournament, let's say you've got the group stages. You've got a lot of games being casted by people like Vince or maybe Just Harry, Banzi even. These casters were very, very good, but they're not the three duos. And then when you get into the main stage, when you get into the main playoffs, that's where you look at things. That's where Sadakist, that's where Anders, that's where Bottle, all of these big hype casters come through, and that's when you realize, that's when it hits you. You're in the major playoffs because you've got a sudden huge increase in talent. You've got a sudden huge increase in what kind of shoutcasting you're getting, what kind of content you're getting, how incredibly engaged you're going to be at that stage. That would change the spectator experience completely. And at the same time, all of these other talent, they're still being utilized. They would be used to make supplementary content. So you could even have meme videos. You can have funny videos to be able to, you know, kind of take up time during delays. You can have videos that are more analysis based. You can have all of these people on the sideline creating content constantly. You can rotate them out in desks so that analysts don't get too tired, so that you have a better product all in all. You can have a secondary stream if you really want to, a newbie stream the way Dota does it, so that you can introduce people to all of these things anew, which is completely and utterly bonkers, and I don't see this being done yet. Of course, you can add that, okay, you know, there's funding problems and everything, and I agree that there are funding problems. But that's something on Valve. Valve has to put in more into these majors, and Valve has to make sure that these majors can actually compete with like the international and worlds in terms of relevancy, because that's how you're going to get new viewers. Quite frankly, that's how you're going to grow your esports scene. These are the hallmarks of Counter-Strike. These are what will bring in an influx of new players, an influx of new spectators, an influx of huge interest within the esports scene that you will have never seen before. That's what happens every single year at the Dota International. That's what happens every single year at the League of Legends World Championship. You had 16 million people watching the LCS Worlds. That is ridiculous. Admittedly, a lot of those viewers come from China, and again, that's where the question about regional storylines comes in, that there's not really that many people from China and everything, but that's a separate topic. That's up to Valve to cultivate the scene over there, however they do it. There's a couple of ways to do it, but I'm not going to get into that in this video, maybe in another video. So you're already looking at a trend so far that these majors aren't the most important event. They don't have epic storylines for viewers. They don't have epic formats where you're definitely going to get the absolute best of the best teams. The majors don't have anything that another tournament doesn't. And that's the big problem. The majors don't have this huge X factor, this huge fact that, okay, it's a 2-week-long tournament. It's a huge group stage. It's a huge double elimination, best of 3 style bracket. There's none of that. It's a CSGO major. It's the same as another event. Sure, there's a slightly bigger prize pool. Sure, there's slightly better showing of players and whatnot, and you know, you've got the title of major, which is all nice and well. There's stickers and that's all nice and well, but it's not the same thing. It simply isn't an undisputed result of who is the absolute best, and that is an absolute tragedy, and that's the tragedy of the Counter-Strike major. Lastly, again, it's a question of funding. It's a question of relevancy, because so far I've talked a little bit about how it's not relevant to the players, and I've talked about how it's not relevant to the viewers. Let's go back to the players, because that's equally, if not even more so important. The CSGO major doesn't have a life-changing prize pool. You look over towards Dota, you've got a $25 million prize pool. You look over towards League of Legends, you've got a huge prize pool as well. League of Legends slightly exceptional in that sense, but it's still a very large prize pool and still a very, very big deal, because that's where the regional storylines and the battle for supremacy comes through. The thing is that when you see that the major isn't testing you to be the best, and when you see that the major isn't testing you to do all of these things, When you see that the major doesn't even have a collection of the best teams in Counter-Strike, when you look over towards the kind of teams that are going to be there, they're not the best. You have a lot of teams that are still missing that perhaps should have been there. NIP, Optic Gaming, all of these teams that could very easily take a couple of best of threes off of quite a few of the teams who are even going to be within the playoff series. They're not there. When you keep all of that in mind, the question becomes, how do you make a major relevant towards a player more so and significantly more so than something like the Epicenter, where you've got 8 of the best teams in the world, more so than something like the Intel Extreme Masters, which have a legacy behind them, which have a history behind them, they have a huge prize pool, they've got so much riding on their backs. How do you do that? Quite frankly, it's the prize pool. It's the fact that you look over towards this major, it's $1 million, and that's not very much anymore. $1 million is not a huge difference from 250K events. We've got 750K events in EPL. We've got 500K events coming through. We've got the WESG games, which are more than $1 million if memory serves correctly. And you've got all of these things that are going on within the world of Counter-Strike that simply can compete with the major. And that's the problem. There shouldn't be anything that can compete with the major. There should never be an event that can hold a candle to the glory of a Counter-Strike Valve-sponsored major. Can you imagine that? That a major sponsored by Valve is no longer as ridiculously, hugely prestigious compared to something like an Epicenter, which is, sure, it's a nice and big event and everything, but the point is, the major is supposed to be the apex of Counter-Strike. The major is supposed to be Counter-Strike coming towards a top. Counter-Strike fighting for 6 months, bringing it all together, bringing the absolute best teams and establishing the world #1 at that time. And because of all the reasons outlined, that simply doesn't happen. We don't have storylines. We have a very short event. The format isn't unique. The format doesn't establish a clear, dominant, absolute best team of that season. There's less talents. There's only the 3 duos. You compare it towards the Dota 2 International 2016, you had 25 people employed as talent. You compare it to any of the CSGO majors, 25 is a ridiculous number. That doesn't even come, we don't come close to 25 in most majors. Finally, there isn't a life-changing prize pool. Players are going to prioritize winning other tournaments because it's more money, it's more fame, it's more prestige. SK doesn't care if they don't win the major as much as they care about winning all of these events that they just did with Bolts, without Phelps. Team Liquid doesn't care about winning the major with Stanislaw as much as they cared about having a better team chemistry and then having a better team chemistry at all of these new other events with Steel on their roster. Astralis, okay, Astralis is a bit of an exception, but all of these teams that are prioritizing roster moves instead of actually maintaining their rosters are simply because they don't care about the CSGO major enough. It's simply because the CSGO major isn't relevant anymore. It's simply because the tragedy of the Counter-Strike major is that it is drowning amongst a sea of tournaments and it has no longer got that huge differentiating factor. Yes, there's extra prestige to it, but really, how much does that matter?